Welcome to this presentation about altruism, and specifically about the bystander effect. The bystander effect is the counterintuitive phenomenon where when a person needs help, if there are a lot of people around, it takes longer for anyone to actually provide help. And you would think it would be just the opposite, right? The more people that are there, the faster somebody should get help. But that's not the way it works. And let me go back to an example I used in a previous PowerPoint presentation. Imagine that after one of my classes one day, one of the students hangs around and we're having a conversation. And right in the middle of the conversation, I drop to the floor and it looks like I'm having some kind of medical emergency and I'm in serious trouble. Now, I don't care who the student that I'm talking to is. It could be somebody I know well, it could be somebody who's a stranger, but I'm very confident that no matter who that individual is, the person will try to do something to help me right away. Now, what the individual might do, I'm not sure. They may just run out into the hallway screaming, "Help, help." They may pull out their phone and dial 911. They might rush to my side and try to provide CPR or some other kind of medical assistance. I don't know what they would do, but I'm very confident if there was just one person there, they would very quickly act to try to help me. On the other hand, if I'm lecturing to a class of 50 students, and right in the middle of the lecture I sort of drop to the floor and lay there and appear to be having some kind of difficulty, the clock would tick, time would go by, and nothing would happen for quite some time. There'd be a lot of nervous giggling and shifting around, and people would be looking at each other while I'm laying there dying on the floor. Now, eventually something would happen and I would get some kind of help, but the point is it would take me much longer to receive help with a whole room full of people there than it would if there was just one person there. And that's what the bystander effect is all about. There are several different reasons why the bystander effect occurs. One of the strongest things that directs it is called diffusion of responsibility. Let me go back to the example that I used of my being in a classroom and appearing to have a medical emergency. If there's only one student there, that student knows that he or she is the only one that sees the emergency and therefore the only one that can take action. There's nobody else to sort of pass the buck to. On the other hand, if I'm standing in front of a room full of 50 people, the responsibility that each individual feels to take action themselves is greatly diminished. Right away, people start thinking things like, well, there must be somebody that knows him better than I do, or there must be somebody with more training than I have to provide help here. And so the responsibility to take action to help somebody gets spread around among the whole crowd, and that makes it less likely that any one individual is going to step up and take action. Another thing that's operating in this situation is something called pluralistic ignorance. Remember the intervention process that I described in the last set of PowerPoint slides. One of the steps we have to get through in order to decide to help somebody in an emergency is to decide that something is in fact an emergency. So if you're walking along a busy city street and you see an individual slumped over in a doorway, unconscious, right next to you and on the sidewalk, this should set off alarm bells. It should not be like that, but is it really an emergency? Should you really be doing something? Well, one of the things we do to figure out what's really going on in any social situation is to look around at other people. Now, when you're in public, nobody likes to look ruffled or upset or out of control. You want to play it cool, you want to be poised, and so you casually glance around at the other people to see if they're showing any concern. Well, the other people are doing the same thing that you're doing, and they're looking at you to help themselves figure out if there's something they should be worried about. And so all of you sort of passively reassure each other that there's really nothing to worry about here, because otherwise somebody would be upset. And so through pluralistic ignorance, we make the decision that there's no real emergency, that there really isn't anything to worry about. And if that wasn't bad enough, on top of that, we really don't like to look foolish in front of other people. Nobody wants to do something that's embarrassing or makes you look silly. And so our tendency to behave at all in front of a crowd of strangers is greatly inhibited. And this will, in addition to pluralistic ignorance and diffusion of responsibility, make you less likely to take action when there are a lot of people around who might see what you're doing. There was a very specific incident that got social psychologists interested in the bystander effect, and it really started the whole line of research on the bystander effect. So let me tell you the story first as it was told, because it was the way the story was told at first that prompted the research by social psychologists. But it turns out, after many years of investigation, the original story turns out not to have been quite accurate. So here's the original story. One night in 1964, a 23-year-old woman by the name of Kitty Genovese was coming home from work late at night, about 1 o'clock in the morning. And as she approached her apartment building, she was attacked by a man. She fought with the man, screamed and hollered, yelled for help, and at a minimum, we know that 38 people witnessed the incident, because that many people admitted that they had watched what was going on. And you could see them sticking their heads out of the window of the apartment building. You could see them silhouetted in the lights of their apartment. So you had all these people watching this attack. Nobody did anything. But the guy who was attacking her saw all these people and got scared away and ran. Kitty Genovese dragged herself to the doorway of her apartment building and then collapsed. Laid there for about 15 minutes, helpless. The man returned, attacked her with a knife while she cried and fought and screamed, and he did eventually kill her. And nobody did anything to help her. That's the original story. You have 38 witnesses who saw this young woman being murdered, and nobody did a thing. This incident became a media sensation, and the spin that the journalists put on it right away was, what is happening to people today? Is there something about modern life in the city that makes us callous and uncaring? Are we not concerned with the well-being of our neighbors, and do we just not care about each other? So that's what the point of the story was. And sure enough, journalists started to unearth similar incidents in various cities around the country where people suffered some kind of terrible accident or violence, and nobody seemed to do anything. And so the question was, is apathy a good explanation? Meaning people just don't care about each other. Well, it turns out apathy is not a very likely explanation, because when they interviewed the individuals who watched this incident unfold, they weren't uncaring or unfeeling. People were traumatized, they were shaking, they were crying, everybody wanted to know if she was okay. And the common refrain they kept hearing was, why didn't anybody do anything? Because the problem was they saw that all these other people were watching and they assumed somebody would be doing something, but nobody did. Well, that's how the story was first told, but it turns out it had been embellished quite a bit. It turns out that they're not sure there were that many people who watched it, and in fact, a number of people did apparently either call the police or holler at the guy who was doing the attacking. And so there was more help going on than was told at the beginning. But it was the original journalistic story that got psychologists interested in the problem. And the fact that the details of this story were not precisely correct doesn't change the fact that the bystander effect seems to be alive and well. So the hypothesis that people are just unfeeling and uncaring, and that's why they don't help, really doesn't seem to be the best explanation for why the bystander effect occurs. So, social psychologists wanted to do some research to find out what are the things that control the bystander effect. What are the things that make it more or less likely to occur? Let me tell you the story of some of the classic early studies on the bystander effect to show you how psychologists would investigate such a thing. The first one has come to be known as the smoke-filled room study, and it's interesting because it shows that even if you yourself are the potential victim of the emergency, you are less likely to help yourself if there are bystanders present. In this study, subjects showed up for an experiment, and they went into this waiting room to fill out a questionnaire. So there was a pile of questionnaires there, and they were just supposed to pick one up and start writing with it. The experimenter was not there at the moment, but there were, in some conditions, a couple of other people there. I'll get to that in a moment. But while the person is in there filling out the questionnaire, the emergency that occurred was smoke started pouring out of a vent in a wall on the side of the room. And at first it just came out in small wisps, but then it got thicker and heavier and the room began to fill up with smoke. So here's the person filling out the questionnaire in a room that's filling up with smoke. Clearly this could be an emergency. Now, when somebody was there alone, almost everybody gets up pretty quickly and leaves the room to try to figure out what's going on. So if the person's alone and the emergency occurs, they take care of business. They try to get to the bottom of it. What happens in a situation where there are two passive Confederates there? So you show up for the experiment. There are two other people there filling out their questionnaires, but they're actually part of the study, although you don't know that. And they're instructed that if you try to ask them anything, they just kind of look confused and shrug their shoulders, and they don't act terribly concerned. Well, in this condition, you found that only 10% of the time did the person get up and leave the room to try to find out what was going on. They noticed the smoke, they coughed, they choked, they rubbed their eyes, some of them even got up and opened a window, but only 10% of the time did they ever actually leave to report the smoke. So even when they themselves were the potential victim, the presence of bystanders made it less likely that anything would happen. Now, when other researchers saw the results of this study, their first reaction was, well, this looks a little fishy. You've got these people in a smoke-filled room that just don't seem to be worried. Maybe that tipped the subjects off that it wasn't a real emergency. So they redid the study, and they had 3 people in the room again, but now they were all real subjects. None of them were part of the experiment. So now you have 3 different people, any one of whom can get up and report the smoke and try to figure out what's going on. In this condition, only 38% of the time did anybody get up to report the smoke. Now, this isn't really better than the 10% in the other condition, because there was only one person who could get up to report it. Now there are 3, and still only a little more than a third of the time does anybody do anything. So the bottom line here is that the presence of other people inhibits our tendency to help ourselves even. Here's another classic study that's come to be known as the Lady in Distress study. In this study, subjects arrived at the laboratory believing that they were involved in a study where they were going to test the market appeal of games and puzzles. So they walk into this room and there are a bunch of tables around with games and puzzles on it, and it looked like they were going to be playing with these things and evaluating how interesting and fun they were. There were 4 different conditions in this experiment. In one condition, people were alone, so they showed up just by themselves. In another condition, they were told to come to the experiment and bring a friend with them. So now there are 2 people, and they're friends. They know each other. In a third condition, you have 2 people who are strangers to each other. They're both real subjects, but they don't know each other. And in the fourth condition, you have a real subject there with another person, but the other person is a passive Confederate. When the emergency occurs, this person is instructed to simply not do anything at all. In any condition, they all show up to the same place. They're greeted by a young woman who's the experimenter. She gives them a questionnaire and has them take a seat. And she steps back into the other side of the room and pulls closed this big partition that separates the large room into two smaller rooms. And the subjects are sitting on one side of the partition. The young woman is on the other side. While they're working on their questionnaires, they hear the young woman walking around and moving things. And there was a very large set of shelves against the wall on the side of the room where the young woman is. And it sounds as if she's pulling a chair over to climb up on it and get something off the shelves. And all of a sudden they hear this terrible crash and a woman scream. And then they hear her sobbing and crying in pain and asking for help. Now, the young woman really wasn't throwing herself on the floor over and over again. This was a very high quality recording. It sounded very realistic. And they were interested in how helpful would people be and would the condition that they were in make a difference. The experimenters were very flexible about what counted as helping behavior. If the person just stayed in their seat but yelled out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" they would have counted that. If the person got up and tried to open the partition, or if they ran out of the room looking for help, any of those responses would have counted as being helpful. Well, you can see from the numbers what happened. When people were alone, 70% of the time, the subject tried to help the young woman. When there were two friends there, she was still helped about 70% of the time, but when you think about it, this isn't as good, because in the alone condition, there's only one person eligible to help. Now there are two people, and she still only helped 70% of the time. When there are two naive strangers, two real subjects who don't know each other, this percentage drops to 40% of the time. And if the subject was there with a passive Confederate who just didn't do anything, it drops all the way down to 7%. Now, the interesting thing from this study that's been replicated in many of the bystander effect studies is that the subjects in these experiments always report that the presence of other people had no effect on their behavior. In other words, they truly believed that they would have behaved the same way alone that they did in the presence of others. But since these subjects were randomly assigned to conditions, that clearly is not the case. Clearly, the presence of bystanders inhibits people from being helpful. In this experiment, they asked people, after the people who didn't help, they asked them, well, why didn't you help? Just to see where they were stuck in the intervention process. 59% of the people who didn't help decided that they weren't sure what had happened, but they decided it wasn't too serious. 25% of them thought it was serious, but they thought that somebody else would help. So there's diffusion of responsibility. There were 3 subjects in the experiment who admitted that they didn't help because they didn't want to embarrass the girl. I mean, it is very embarrassing to be found suffering and dying somewhere, and they were going to spare her from that. So let me give you one more example. This study has come to be known as the epileptic seizure study. The scenario here, this was done at Columbia University, is that university students who were participating were in a study where they thought the experimenter was looking at the pressures and stress experienced by students in high-pressure urban academic environments. And so they thought they were going to be there to talk a little bit about the things that stress them out and how they deal with it. They were placed in a very small room along the corridor. They were given a microphone and a set of headphones, and they were positioned in the room. And there were supposedly other subjects in the other rooms, but they did not meet these people face to face. The experimenter left because he said he didn't want to inhibit the discussion and he wanted people to be able to speak anonymously. And so the way the procedure worked was each subject in the experiment would speak for 2 minutes. Their microphone would come on, they would talk, everybody could hear through their headphones what the other person was saying, and then the light on their microphone would switch off and they would not, their mic didn't work anymore, and it was the next person's turn to speak. Now, the trick here, the independent variable, was how many other people did the subject think was in the experiment. In one condition, it was just the subject and the person who was going to be the victim of the emergency. In another condition, there was the subject, the victim, and one other person. And in a third condition, there was the subject, the victim, and 4 other people. Now, in reality, there was only one subject there each time. The way they manipulated this was to have a tape with the voices of different numbers of people on it. And the real subject was always the last one to speak. And so that's how the person could tell how many other people were there. But they were really the only subject. So the victim was always the first person to speak. And this person came on and started speaking with obvious embarrassment about his being prone to having seizures, especially when studying hard or taking exams, and that for him, this was the most serious problem he had to deal with. And he talked at some length about that. After 2 minutes, his microphone was turned off. And then in the one condition, the subject spoke, or in the other conditions, the bogus other subject spoke. And then for the second round, they went back to the beginning and the victim spoke again. The second time around, as the victim started to speak, very quickly he began stuttering and choking and begging for help, and it was obvious that he was having a seizure. And so the dependent variable was, how long did it take the subject to get up and try to help? All right, let's start with the condition where you've got just the subject there and the victim. 85% of the people in this condition got up immediately and tried to help. 100% responded eventually, so everybody did something. And the average amount of time it took for the person to receive help was 52 seconds. So in less than a minute, people got up and ran around looking for the victim by opening the other doors in the hallway. Now, if the subject was there with the victim and even one other person, now only 62% of them got up and helped right away. Only 85% ever helped. And even for those who did help, the average amount of time that it took was now 93 seconds, a little more than a minute and a half on average for the individual to receive help. And when you had the subject and the victim and 4 other people there, these percentages got even worse. Only 31% got up and helped right away. Only 62% ever helped. And even for those who did help, the average amount of time was now a whopping 166 seconds. We're talking about almost 3 minutes on average for help to be given. Follow-ups to this study showed that there are some things you could do to make people more helpful. For example, if people met each other face-to-face before the experiment started, people were more helpful than when everybody was anonymous. Also, if the victim in the first go-round said that they carried a little jar of pills in their shirt pocket, and that if while they were having their seizure, somebody stuffed one of those in their mouth, and that helped them, this increased the rate of helpfulness because now people knew what to do. In the intervention process, that step of not knowing what action to take had been resolved. So there were things that could make people more helpful. But the bystander effect, once again, was clearly demonstrated in this study. So why did I select the bystander effect as one of the few topics to lecture on in this part of the course? Well, regardless of what grade you get in the course or what you remember years from now, remembering the bystander effect can make you a more effective, helpful person. For me, this was a very, very real thing. I still remember the first time I learned about the bystander effect. I was in a graduate course in social psychology when I was a grad student, and we were reading about some of the classic experiments I was just telling you about, and learning that the presence of other people makes you less helpful. Well, not more than a week after this, I was traveling by bus across the country and got stranded in the Port Authority bus station in New York City overnight. And it's about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting around in a small group of people. People are kind of dozing off. There might have been around a dozen of us there. And this guy came along, stuck his hand in a woman's purse, grabbed her wallet, and ran away. She woke up, started screaming for help, and I'm sitting there in this crowd of people looking around thinking, well, God damn it, nobody's going to do anything. It was almost like I was being tested. I had just learned about the bystander effect, and then I was put in a situation where I knew that nobody was going to do anything because of the bystander effect. So my knowledge of the bystander effect made me get up. Now, I didn't chase the guy through the streets of New York, but I did get up and try to find a policeman who then came to see what he might do. And they actually found the guy hiding in an empty bus in the garage 20 minutes after the crime, which I'm not advocating a life of crime, but if you're going to do it, have some pride in your work. The fact that he was hiding 50 feet away from the scene of the crime seems a little silly to me. But my point is, my knowledge of the bystander effect made me less likely to fall prey to it. And many other times in my life, I've been in situations in public places where something happens where somebody needs help. And I've always been very quick to go and provide help just because I know about the bystander effect. And nothing bad happens. If it turns out it's not a real emergency, people just smile and they're pleased that you cared enough to try, and nothing bad happens. But if they really did need help, you get a lot of satisfaction from having done something, and people feel good about you. They come up and they shake your hand and they thank you for doing things. So remember the bystander effect and use it to be a better person in the future.